As I think about everything I've read in Scripture and over the years and the totality of what I've read, I'd have to say that Genesis chapter 3 is the most significant chapter in Scripture. Now that's a bold statement because you start thinking about, well, the New Testament and this and that, but let me tell you why. Why would I make such a bold assertion? In a comprehensive spiritual sense, Genesis chapter 3 expresses the entire storyline of God's plan of redemption in history in Genesis chapter 3. Let's look at some of this. So we start with this perfection of creation, and we see this at the end of chapter 1, Genesis 1:31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. In other words, it was perfect. And there was evening and there was morning of the sixth day. So that we're at that point at the beginning of chapter 3. Chapter 3 begins where everything is still very good. Everything is perfect. Everything is existing in perfect cooperative harmony with God, just as he intended it. The next thing that happens is this corruption of creation. And we see this in Genesis 3, 6a through 7a, as the abbreviated version. Eve, took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband Adam, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. At that point, death, sickness, disease, plagues, infestations, etc. began to ravage every living thing on earth. Things started to wind down. We understand that as the second law of thermodynamics. Everything started going from order to disorder. And mankind quickly descends into this state of enmity with God. And then mankind sitting there, Adam and Eve at that time, and they have no answer to this. They have no mitigation strategy for the situation. It's just, oh no, everything's different. Then we get to the redemption of creation in Genesis 3:15. Genesis 3:15, this is Jesus speaking to Satan. And he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring, and he will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. So basically what we see here is there's this deliverer who's coming. There's a deliverer coming. It's going to come down the bloodline of the woman, the seed of the woman, the bloodline, to redeem and buy back what's been lost. This deliverer is going to defeat Satan and all of his spiritual offspring. And then we know this deliverer now, because we know the rest of the story, it was Jesus. And it was Jesus talking there. It was the Lord Jehovah, Jesus, talking to them. And basically he was telling Satan, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring, and I'm going to bruise your head even though you bruise my heel, because he's talking about himself. And then we get to the rest of the story, the culmination of creation. And we know this from many verses, but in 1 Corinthians 15:24, this is what it says. Then comes the end, when he, Jesus, who's the promised seed of the woman, delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule, every authority and power. So this entire saga of evil and sin and corruption and death and the choosing of sides, whose side am I going to be on, God's side, Satan's side, of that whole big war just ends at one point when God's timeline for history is finished. And all of this comes out of Genesis chapter 3. And it's in a way that we can really understand it. So the rest of Scripture, other than Genesis chapter 3, does what? It fills in all the details of how all of this has been happening, how it is currently happening, and how it will eventually happen. Or put another way, Genesis chapter 3 is the why, the rest of Scripture is the how.